Hi. Today I'm going to do a video about how wine is made. It occurred to me I was actually putting notes together for a different video on sparkling wine, champagne more specifically. And I thought about that and it's like I never did one on actually just regular old wine. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is how is wine made. Just the generic basic type of thing. And just to answer the first question, what am I drinking? This is a little Chardonnay out of California. Chardonnay is not generally my favorite, but it's every so often it's nice. I happen to have some open, so here I am. Okay, so let's give a sip of this first. Okay, now I'm ready to go. Alright, so one thing I want to talk about real briefly up front is we're talking about regular wine, like a glass of Chardonnay or bottle for that matter. Cabernet Sauvignon, any of those are generally referred to as still wines. Now, about the only time you hear that is when you're talking also in reference to sparkling wines. So let's talk about how still wines are made. Now, I am not a winemaker, so bear with me on this. There might be a few little things I state wrong, because I tend to do that from time to time, thinking one way and talking the other way, but try and get it accurate. So lots and lots and lots of factors go into making wine. I mean, obviously you have to have a vineyard and those types of things. But a lot of it depends on the type of grape, where you're at, and so forth. So we'll kind of touch on some of those. Let's start with the very basics. Let's say you decide you're going to be a winemaker. Well, one of the things you have to do, of course, is acquire a chunk of land to plant some grapes on. So you get this little piece of land, and we're going to assume it's not already planted in grapes, because you can't buy pre-planted vineyards too. Somebody's been making wine for years, they die or they're retiring or whatever, so they sell off their land. Or it's inherited from the parents to the children, so the children take over the vineyards and the wine production, all that. In that case, you're not planting necessarily. Now let's say that you're going to just venture out on your own, you're going to start from scratch, you get this piece of land, you go ahead and pre-order some plants that are already started, maybe 1-year-old type plants. You go out and dig up the ground, get them in there. You've planned out what you're going to plant. Over here it's going to be this grape, and over here it's going to be that grape. You got all those plants made, so you get the little guys in the ground. So you have to pay attention to a number of things, and one of those factors right off the bat is make sure they survive the first year. That's a big thing. So you have to make sure they have enough water to grow, and there's no little critters gnawing off the tops, that type of thing. So you get your first year ready. Your first year, you planted in the spring, it's now fall time, it's harvest time. You go out to harvest your grapes that first year and you discover there aren't any. That's because you don't usually get any crops of significance until about the third year. So you come around to the third year, it's like here's a handful here, a few grapes here, a few grapes there, but they're kind of not that great. So you still haven't got a lot of grapes to start with, and once you do have are not that good. So again, it takes a while to establish this. Kind of the rule of thumb I've heard is from planting first year to harvest, or first good harvest, is about 7 years. So we've zoomed down the time track a while here. Now we're 7 years down the road, and our grapes are doing fine. Our vineyard's looking good. We go out, they sprouted from the spring. You go out. Now part of that maintenance of the vineyard, you have to trim them back, keep them, keep the green part, what's called the canopy, keep that in check. If you're in certain areas, if you got your little cluster grapes here, you want the grapes to kind of hang over it and shade it if you've got super hot sun. Or another thing too, if it's real windy, you want to kind of protect them from the wind. If you're in a cooler climate, a little further north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern hemisphere, and closer to the pole, whichever one it is, then maybe you want to trim that canopy back so it gets more sun, so it can ripen as early as possible. When you're in a colder region, way north or way south, you don't have the same growing seasons you've got closer to the equator. And I'm not talking on the equator, I'm talking southern parts of Europe, for example, or southern Central Coast to almost Southern California. Those areas, much longer growing season. They get a lot more sun. So you have to kind of adjust everything for where you're at. That's part of the terroir. Talked about that in other videos. We won't go into it now. Okay, so you've successfully grown a nice crop of grapes, and it's, you're looking at your little calendar watch and it says, okay, it's time to harvest, or will be in a little bit. So now you're watching the weather, because one of the things you don't want to happen is to have to harvest in bad weather or have a lot of rain right before harvest. Why? Why is the rain bad? Well, a lot of people think, give your plants a lot of water so they grow big and strong and all that. Well, that doesn't work well for grapes. Grapes actually do better when, or at least for wine, they do better when they're in stressed environments. That means not too much rain. You get your little small grapes like this, and all of a sudden, right before harvest, you get a lot of rain. Well, they swell up and they start getting bigger, and they burst the skin. So you've got a ruined crop that way. It's kind of like the last minute, you've got these little balloons that they've got some juice in them, and you decide, let's fill those up a lot more. You hook them up to the hose, just like a water balloon. It just goes so big and then they pop. So you don't want that. You also, even if it doesn't get to that point, you don't want that juice that you've nurtured all summer long to be real diluted with the last minute rain. And then there's also the issues of mildew and damp and everything like that. Once you harvest them, if they're too wet on the outside, you can get all kinds of bad stuff growing that way. All right, so you've overcome all those obstacles. You've harvested your crop. It's in good condition. Now what? Okay, so you've got all these grapes, tons of grapes. You got to do something with them because they're not going to turn into wine by themselves, generally speaking. So the first thing, you have to do a press or a crush. So you take them into whatever device you're using, a mechanical one probably, and it might be a destemmer, de-seeder. They've got all kinds of cool stuff that does this for you if you can afford it. But you take these grapes and you decided you don't want the stems on. You're going to just crush them and let it go from there. So you crush them to get that juice available, loosened up, and you put them in a big vat and basically what we're going to call a fermentation tank. So possibly stainless steel, possibly something else. It's lots of different ways to do this. Cement, what they call concrete eggs, or another one, or cement eggs. That's a not new, but a rediscovered form of fermentation. Another one is amphora, which are big clay pots, all kinds of different ways. Or just, a big carboy of some sort, some kind of container. So you get all the grapes in there, they're kind of crushed down, you've got some juice going, you've got some skins, and we're going to assume we're making a red here for this. Oh, so that all gets going. Well, all that together is kind of what they call the must. That's your grapes and skins and all that type of stuff all together, your juice, and while it's fermenting, that becomes your must. M-U-S-T, just like the English word you must have must if you're going to make wine. So give it some time, and now as it ferments, you've been checking different things. You got your little kits out probably, or depending on how old and traditional you are, you might be tasting it, make sure there's sugar in there, enough sweetness. In some areas, it's allowed to add sugar to the juice. If it's very far north in France, I know this is allowed. In, what am I thinking of? Burgundy, for example, I believe that's one of the areas. And further north beyond that, since they tend to be colder areas, shorter growing seasons, they don't always develop enough sugar to get a good fermentation. Champagne is a region like that. That's a little bit further north of Burgundy, I believe. It's at least close to the same latitude as Burgundy. I have to check a map on that. So if there's not quite enough sugar, which this can be measured, there's little test kits and things that can be used. If you don't have enough sugar to get a good fermentation, then you can add sugar into it, and that is called chaptalization. Chaptalization. It's easier to say it fast, I think. And it just means that you've added sugar to it, and generally for the purposes of fermentation. So now you've adjusted everything. You may have added this or countered that somehow that you feel is out of balance to get just the right conditions. You check on it, check the temperature. It may be a controlled temperature fermentation tank. You're keeping it a particular temperature range just to make it do better. If you've added a hybrid yeast to it, and maybe killed off the wild yeast, added a specific yeast that you want or like that does better for you or for your grapes, then it may do better at a particular temperature also, so you can control that given the right equipment. So you go along a couple weeks later, you're checking this, and you start getting all the little bubbles in it. Well, this is carbon dioxide that's coming off of it. You punch down the cap, which the skins tend to float to the top and form what they call a cap, so that's often punched down every so often. And that just gets more exposure to the juice below that's fermenting into wine, exposure to those grapes, and that cap, get it all in there. So you go through all this, and now it comes to the end, the bubbles have stopped, there's no more CO2 coming out, which means your fermentation is done. You're not going to get any more alcohol out of that. You're probably checking that as you go along as well. So, got thirsty work here. All right, so your juice is fermented, and now what? Okay, well, one of the first things you need to do at this point is you separate that juice from that cap. You want to, all this stuff that's the debris, the hard stuff, the skins, the stems, if you did it that way, seeds, whatever's in there, all that needs to be separated away from the wine. So you want this, you take the wine over here, and now you're ready to do the next step. So at this point in that process where you're separating them out, several things can happen. You may take it and write, say a Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, you might take it directly from that fermentation tank into barrels for aging. So now you've got your big barrels. I don't know the sizes right off the top of my head, but they're in gallons, probably about 50 gallons, maybe a little more, a little less, which would translate to 200 liter or so. So here's the big oak barrels. You just take it right into there and fill that barrel up to the top, seal it off, and stack it on a shelf with all the other barrels. And then now it starts its aging process. Or if it's one that's not going to be aged, from there you might run it through a filter, a finer filter possibly, to separate all the little small bits out. You definitely want to strain whatever, either going into a barrel or ultimately into bottles. You want to strain off the big chunks like the grape skins and things like that, or any random leaves that may have fallen in, whatever. You want to screen it just to get all the big chunks out. In some cases you also want to filter it for a little bit more clarity. There are also things that can be added to it at this point to clarify it. In other words, make it that nice pretty color that you can see through, and all these types of things. Part of that's cosmetic, part of it is not. So let's say we'll come back now. At this point, if you're not going to age it, then it's going to go basically into bottles. So we'll come and pick that up in a little bit. Now this other one over here, this cab, you decide you're going to barrel age it, so it gets put in the barrels, and it goes in special racks so it can lay sideways. So you've got the round part going this way, and then the top part, the actual top of it, is now sideways. So you're laying them on their sides that way. There's usually what they call a bunghole that you can go in and sample periodically. That would be rolled to the top so it's accessible and doesn't leak. So in the aging process, you might check on it periodically as the winemaker. You're not going to open it up a lot, but you're certainly not going to open them all up. If you had 100 barrels, that's probably a lot for a particular vineyard or vintage. You might periodically check this one, that one, take little samples out and see how it's doing, if it's aging the way you think it should or whatever. So you're kind of quality control testing as it's aging. That goes on for however long you're going to be aging, if it's 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. So let's say now you've got your current vintage of this light one over here that did not get oaked, and maybe a couple years back that one's ready to get bottled. So you've got this year and this year minus 2 years. You got two different ones going, and they both need to get bottled. You wouldn't necessarily have to bottle them at the same time. You'd probably take your current vintage, bottle it first, and then after that maybe take your time a little bit more and pull off the 2-year-old or the 1-year-old or whichever it is. So same concept. When you get there, you're going to take it from the bigger tank, the barrel, or the fermentation tank, into the bottles. It goes through a little processing in the sense of again, the straining off and possibly filtering, and that would be a determination made by the vintner, who's making the wine, the winemaker, whether it needs to be filtered or not, whether that's a desired quality, how much filtration, what else they need to do to it. Do you want that nice, clean, hold your glass up to the light and see through it type wine, or do you want something that is a little bit more cloudy and rustic or rough? And again, that's a winemaker determination. So at some point, you're going to finish all those types of things, and now it goes into the bottles. So you have different types of hardware. If it's a big tank, it just drains it, you pour it all into it, and it just pumps it right in these little bottles. Might have multiple things that fill up bottles, pulls up, and those bottles slide by, and the next batch come in and get filled up, and slide by and filled up. It could be a hand operation type thing where you literally pull a crank down, it puts that little spigot in there, you fill them up one at a time, pull that up, and then pass it to your buddy next to you, and they do the next thing. Well, that next thing, of course, is putting the cork in the bottle. So there are little hand corking machines, kind of like probably similar to the rabbit corkscrew, only working in reverse, and it compresses the end of it and pushes it down into the bottle, then you release it, and you're good to go. So you put the cork in. Actually, there is a little bit another step. Then you put the capsule on, most typically, and that can be a foil capsule. And capsule is a little part on the top that it just covers the cork. So it's kind of like a little lid that goes on there. Often they are aluminum foil type thing, but you're seeing more and more of the plastic ones. A lot of that depends on the cost of the wine. If it's a low-end wine, that capsule is likely to be plastic. If it's a higher-end one, it's likely to be the metal foil. And all those, of course, you've pre-ordered, you've got set up, so you can just go right on. The plastic ones are probably, for the most part, heat shrink type thing. You put a heat gun on it, and it just shrinks it to form fit. So that the capsule actually does a couple things. It kind of protects the cork. It's kind of a second defense against air getting in if there's a slight flaw in the cork or something. That capsule, if it's very tight, can also keep the air out. And to an extent, it will protect the lip of the bottle so you don't get like little tiny chips in it, which I don't know if that would make that big a difference unless you're drinking out of the bottle, I suppose. So from that point, then it goes in, you've got your cork in, your capsule on. Next thing, slap on a label. Of course, the labels are pre-printed and pre-made. And then start boxing them up into case boxes or however you're going to do that part of it. Probably take the one case boxes, palletize those for shipping or storage, one of the two. So those are the basic steps from there. Once it's made and in the bottle, then of course it goes out to the distribution network, which might be to an exporter, import-export person or company rather. Or you might put them in the back room and you're going to sell them yourself. You might have your wine club that you're selling to. Any type of means to get them off the premises and into paying customer hands. That's your goal there. So that's kind of an overview. There's lots and lots of things that go into that I didn't touch on. There's a lot of chemistry work involved throughout the whole process. Checking your balances of this and that, doing some minor adjustments where appropriate. If your acidity is too high, too low, that can be adjusted. The tannins, that's something you would kind of monitor, especially as if you're aging it in the oak, you would want to be looking for that to see if your tannin level is where you want it to be. There's so much science that goes into winemaking. Back in the olden days, I guess you could call them, definitely 100 years or more ago, a lot of that was done by experience. The winemaker would go out in the vineyards and sample grapes, here and there, and say, no, too sour, too this, too that, not ready yet. Then come back a week later, start sampling, getting there, and then come down again, sample. It's like, oh yeah, these grapes are good, let's try some more. Yep, these are ready to harvest. So based on that winemaker's personal taste of the raw grapes off the vine would determine when the harvest was to take place or how it was to take place. It might be a multi-pass through the vineyard, so you go through and pick just the clusters that are predominantly ripe. You probably always have a couple that aren't. then come back a week later, pick the next ones, only the ripe ones, and maybe a third pass, pick up the rest. So that would be determined just by walking through those vineyards and sampling. It's like, yeah, they're getting close, or oh, they need a lot more time. And again, that would come from experience. So the winemakers in those days would, pass that knowledge down to the next generation. So, come along, son, daughter, whatever, walk with me. What are you tasting that? What's your opinion? And they'd both try them, and 2 grapes off the same cluster, or whatever. And the elder, the master winemaker in this case, would be asking the young apprentice, what's your opinion? Is it ready to harvest yet or not? So these types of factors. We're going into the older style. Now you have something a little bit more sophisticated if you choose to use it, which is testing for sugar levels, things like that. Along the same line, you've got the mechanical aids that can help in harvesting. The better wines are still pretty much hand harvested. Again, just like I was talking about, get just the ripe ones, come back a week later, pick the next round, and a week after that, pick the last of them possibly. So you can combine that. You can have a little tractor thing following people, the actual pickers around, so they can dump what they picked into the bigger thing and it gets hauled off to the presses. So you can still mechanize in that way, just rather than carrying the full baskets all the way back and then walking back to the vineyard to continue harvesting. You can have a little automation in terms of transportation, along with full-on harvesters that just fit down both sides of a row of grapevines, and they just pick everything off, sorting out the leaves, extras, big pieces of stems, and get just the clusters, completely mechanized. The drawback there, they may not be getting only ripe fruit. They're going to get the ones that's ripe, the ones that's not ripe. So mechanized picking is kind of bad in that respect because it's pretty much always just a single pass on a row of grapes. All right, let's see what else has come into play. It used to be when you were doing your fermentation, a lot of factors were out of your control. You've got the big outbuilding that's close to the house but not attached to the house, where all the fermentation and that type of thing takes place. But it was subject to the elements, just like a big old barn in the countryside. There's no heating, there's no air conditioning. It's covered, so it's out of the elements, but it's still going to be hot, cold, depending on what the temperature outside is. So during that fermentation process, you can get a temperature that's going up and down, which may or may not impact the wine. Probably it would, and probably not in a positive way. If you had a cold spell, it would definitely slow it down. If the weather was really hot, well, it would ferment even faster. And that's just the conditions provided to the yeast there. So the yeast do better when it's warmer than they do when it's colder. They slow down just like we do. If we're outside without a coat, we kind of slow down. So having temperature controlled fermentation tanks, takes that variable out of the mix. You can say, okay, I want it to ferment at this temperature, keep it there, just like inside the house. I feel comfortable when the temperature is right here. If it's up here it's too hot, down here it's too cold. I want that Goldilocks point just right in the middle. So that's something that in more modern winemaking is available, the temperature control on the fermentation. And again, the chemistry and testing comes into it. Now that it's fermenting, how fast is that alcohol coming up? How much sugar is left? How much of this? How much of that? What's the acidity like? What do we need to do some adjustments halfway through or partway through this process? All those things can be controlled now where they couldn't 100 years ago. And before, it was, the experienced winemaker, he's going through, and as he, takes a little bit of that must out and checks it every so often just to taste it or smell it, these types of things. How's that fermentation coming? Do we need to do something that it tastes like it needs a little bit more of this, or it's already got too much of that? What can we do about that? There's some things that could be done, but it was a lot more imprecise. It wasn't as exact as it can be now. So post-fermentation, well, then again, the mechanized bottling is a big boom to winemakers. It's much easier to get all the juice together and let it just run through kind of a little assembly line and fill up all the bottles, and it saves a lot of time. And if you're paying for labor, then you're saving a lot of money that way. There are situations that or companies that cater to smaller wine production facilities where they've got a lot of the mechanized parts mobilized, in the sense that they put it on the back of a truck or a couple trucks and they drive it out to the vineyard. It's arranged, it's scheduled. It's not, they don't just show up on a Tuesday. But they've got the machines that actually put the wine in the bottles on a little conveyor belt, and they handle all that part of it, so you can bottle up dozens of cases in a really short amount of time compared to doing it all by hand. Same thing as once the bottles are filled and it goes down that line, they cork them and then put the capsule on, and some of them may even put it in the cases for you. Depends on how sophisticated that mobile situation is. So that saves the winemakers money, in the sense they don't have to buy all that equipment up front, which could be pretty pricey, and they don't have to maintain it or keep it laying around in between times. Because realistically, you're only going to be bottling, you're fermenting and bottling probably only in the fall. At least that's when your fermentation is going on after harvest. So once that point comes, you want to put it in the bottles. That's, once it's in the bottle, you don't have a need for bottling machines again until the next year. So let's see, what have I not talked about? I think that pretty much covers most of it. Someday maybe talk about the whole distribution network and how it ends up in my store, for example. Because how does it get from that winery someplace in Italy over to this store for me to sell to my customers locally? So that might be a future topic. I've kind of got that on the list someplace, I believe. So if you have any other questions about wine, about this video, feel free to ask them. Send them to me in email. That's the best way. I don't always get around to checking comments like I should, and that's on me, but I try, but sometimes I just miss them. So if you do have questions, the best way to reach me is to send it via email, and that would be to WindDownQA@gmail.com, and I will have that for you somewhere here, up there, wherever. Anyway, and also in the comments, or in the down below part. So yes, any questions about wine, or if you have a suggestion that you'd like to see a video on, this one was kind of indirectly came from a request for a video, which I don't know if I'll do it today, but I'll get to it soon. And so if you have a request for a video topic, I've got a couple of those. Those are going to be my next two videos, actually, both for suggested topics. I will be doing those sometime very soon. And so if you have one, definitely send it to me also at WindDownQA@gmail.com, and we'll take care of those for you that way. So I think I've got everything covered, and I guess I should say this. It's kind of the thing on YouTube now. If you haven't already, subscribe. I appreciate that. And if you're the type of person who likes to have that, hit that little bell icon wherever it's at, and that will send out a little reminder to you to say, hey, there's a new video for you to watch. So like, subscribe, hit the bell, all those things, and that'll help me make my channel better, and hopefully get more videos out to you in a more timely fashion. So in the meantime, thanks for watching, and cheers.